Hello, I'm Mishka Balsam, host of the GNCC's 2020 Niagara Economic Summit series, and welcome to this, our first of a three-part weekly series where we draw on experts from around the country and region to assess where we are right now, where we can go from here, and how we can get there. Let us acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and Indigenous people, both in shaping and strengthening this region in particular, and our province and country as a whole. None of us could have imagined the unprecedented challenges presented by a global pandemic in Canada and around the world. The series is taking an in-depth look at the big issues that are shaping our region, our world actually. In today's session, we are joined by experts assessing our current situation and to quantify the total economic impact of the pandemic on our lives and industries. Our second segment, held next Tuesday on November the 17th, will identify Niagara's opportunities for smart and sustainable regrowth that benefits the entire community, everything from affordable housing to public transportation. And our final session on Tuesday, November the 24th, will speak to those sectors hit hardest by this pandemic and the strategies that can be put in place to speed up their recovery and ensure future growth. For the next hour and a half, the basic format of this interactive radio conversation is that of a dialogue asking ourselves the questions. Are governments and businesses up for the challenge of a second wave of infections? How will the economic recovery play out? And what are the risks regionally, nationally, and globally? Has the pandemic exposed the shaky foundation of our hyper-connected world? How can we overcome the daunting challenges? And many more. This series is presented in partnership with Niagara Region Economic Development, Goodman School of Business, Brock University, Niagara College, DDL and Company, RBC, Deloitte, BDC, Niagara Workforce Planning Board, Pegasus Aviation, Easy Rock, and Newstock 610 CKDB. And here's a message from our title sponsor, Niagara Region Economic Development.
We are Niagara Region's Economic Development Team,
supporting the local business community to build, expand, and develop is our top priority.
We know that now more than ever, this support is vital
as we navigate the effects of COVID-19 and work towards building a more resilient community together.
Collaboration and partnerships are at the heart of everything that we do.
Aligning our work with stakeholders across the region is essential to Niagara's future prosperity.
We're here to help Niagara businesses maximize opportunities and grow stronger.
We provide economic research and analysis to inform decision-making across the region.
We are a resource for the region's exporters.
We help businesses navigate funding options, financing programs, and investment opportunities.
We develop regional strategic plans to visualize our future economy.
We support existing businesses and our key economic sectors.
We work hard to attract new investment to Niagara.
Niagara Region's Economic Development Team is here to support a successful, resilient, and sustainable economy.
Let's build a strong, thriving Niagara together.
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 Today's conversation is in the hands of our moderator, Rashmi Biswas, Executive Vice President of Lake & Associates, specializing in leadership and development, team effectiveness, and process facilitation. She's also an instructor at the Center of Innovation, Management and Enterprise Education with the Goodman School of Business at Brock University, a program facilitator with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, and she's the author of the motivational book, Rash Decisions, Accept Where You Are and Then Be Amazing. She holds degrees from Sheffield Hallam University and Manchester Metropolitan University. But before passing it all over to Rashmi, here is a message from RBC.
Well, I had a lady who sent me an email the other day, and she thanked me for saving her life. So it's pretty neat. Hi, my name is John Petrie. I'm the owner and operator of Niagara Trailers, just outside of the town of Niagara Lake. We were approached originally on a Facebook post on our homepage. Is there anybody that could help frontline workers to be able to isolate from their families but stay home and be safe? So really, they can actually live in the trailer. They would go to work, they come home, they'd stay in the trailer, but they'd still be able to see their family. They're in great shape. They have furnaces in them. They have hot water, microwaves, small refrigerators. Some even had TVs in them. For isolation units, they actually work very well. Like I have one case where I've got a police officer and his wife is a nurse. They're isolating together in one unit. We've had like paramedics. The local St. Catharines Fire Station, we had another lady reach out to us. She runs one of the long-term care facilities in Hamilton. Her comment back to me was, this virus is not going to get in my facility on my watch. We had the two that actually lived in the car. That was pretty sweet. Like they were, basically crying on the phone when they heard we were going to give them a trailer. The relief when you actually talk to them, they're on the phone. Some of them, it's just dead silence. Like they really don't know what to say. Professional carpet cleaners in St. Catharines, they reached out to us and said, hey, when you get the units back, we're going to come in and clean them, disinfect them for you at no charge. It's pretty neat to have a business that's successful enough to be able to help the community in a time like this. Second generation business going on to the third. The community's been good to us, so we should be good to the community. My dad used to always say, if we got a lemon, you got to make lemonade. So that's what we kind of did.
Good morning. My name is Rashmi Biswas, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the Economic Summit hosted by the GNCC. We have a slightly different format for you today, and we thank you for joining us and taking the time to log in and join us on this live stream. The format for this morning is that we will first hear from Pierre Clareau, our keynote speaker, and then we will break into a panel with 4 distinguished guests. Just before I introduce Mr. Clareau, I'd like just to draw your attention to a couple of other features. You've no doubt spent a lot of time in virtual settings over the last few months, and I'm sure you're used to being able to participate in chat. And of course, this is no different. We'd be delighted if you would join us in the chat function, which you will find under the video feed. Feel free to post any questions that you might have there, and we'll make sure we have some time at the end of the panel discussion to take your questions. You will also see some polling, and we encourage you to participate in the polling. And as we go through the morning, we will, of course, check in with the polls and report the results to you. So I'd like us to get started, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker this morning, Pierre Clareau. Pierre Clareau was appointed Vice President, Research and Chief Economist at BDC in 2012. In his 25 years as an economist, he was Vice President, Business Analysis in the government of Saudi Arabia's National Industry Clusters Development Program and was the Quebec Assistant Deputy Minister for Economic Development, Innovation and Export Trade. He worked for 12 years at the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses in various roles, including economist and Quebec Vice President. He holds graduate degrees from Laval University and the MIT Sloan School of Management. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Pierre Clareau and invite him to launch our morning's discussion with his keynote Power Talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my presentation. So my presentation has 2 parts. First, I want to talk about how the economic recovery is happening and also what should we expect for the next 12 months. The second part is how the pandemic has changed consumer trends. So let's start with the world economy. As you can see from this graph, the pandemic has a huge impact on every economies around the world. China is the only major economy that is going to have a positive growth this year. And the reason for that, they have a strong manufacturing sector that has been back to the pre-crisis level, which is really helping the economy. But other major economies like the United States, Japan, Germany, Canada, all these developed economies are going to have a contraction this year around 5%. Other major economies are going to do even worse. France, United Kingdom, Italy are going to have a contraction around 10%. So as you can see, COVID-19 is really having an impact on the world economy. The good news is the world trade is actually coming back quickly. We're not back to the pre-crisis level, but as you can see from this graph, it's actually coming back faster than during the last recession. But the biggest worry that we have is that the fact that the second wave, the number of cases around the world is really increasing. If you look at this graph, you can see the daily new cases per million, and major economies like France in light blue really having a large number of new cases. Same thing for the United Kingdom that we see in red on the graph, or the United States that we see in blue. So for economists, that's probably the biggest concern we have, the fact that the second wave of the virus is very important around the world. So do we expect a contraction of the world economy of 4.4% and a rebound in 2021? The United States now, as you know, the United States is a very important economy for Canada. 85% of Ontario export is going to the United States. And the pandemic had a huge impact on the economy south of the border. During the lockdown, the US economy lost more than 20 million jobs. And since the lockdown is over, the number of jobs has been increasing, but they have recuperated only half of the job loss. So we still have a long way to go, as you can see from this graph. The US government has put some money in the economy, especially in the spring, for about $500 billion. They transfer businesses, they transfer program to people and also to businesses. And for consumers or for Americans, it's on the tax rebate and also on expanding the unemployment benefits. But these programs had an impact right in April when the disposable income increased, which was helping the economy. But they didn't have another program since, because the Republican and the Democrat couldn't agree on the second program helping Americans. So now that the election is over, we might see a new program before Christmas. But as you can see, the disposable income, it did increase in April, but has slowing down over the summer, just because there was no second program. So this is helping the economy, but not enough to stimulate the recovery as much as they could. Again, the biggest worry for the US is the number of new cases. Here you see the daily new cases per million for the US in blue, for Canada in red. As you can see, the US, the situation is almost out of control. This has the potential to really postpone the recovery that we are seeing in the United States. So this year we expect a contraction of the US economy by 4.3% and a rebound in 2021. But we don't expect the US economy to go back to the pre-crisis level before 2022. Canada now, this is how we see the situation of the pandemic in Canada. We see that in three phases. The first one was the lockdown that we had in the spring. The second phase was what I call the initial recovery. So when the lockdown was over, businesses were able to reopen, they were able to create jobs again. So we are basically at the end of this initial recovery. Finally, there's the third phase, the phase that will take us back to the pre-crisis level. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about phase number 2, where we are today, and also phase number 3, what should we expect in the next 12 months? So this is where we are today. During the lockdown, the Canadian economy lost 3 million jobs, but since the economy has reopened, the number of jobs created has been very important. Actually, we're almost back to the pre-crisis level. We are at 97% the level of job in February. So this is quite a strong recovery. If we look by sector, you can see that some sectors of our economy have been performing better. Finance, insurance, and real estate are back to the pre-crisis level. Manufacturing, they are at 99% the level of job of February. This is for Canada. Actually, for Ontario, the number is 102. So that means that there's more people working in manufacturing today in Ontario than they were in February. But that's not the case for every sector of the economy. If you look down at the bottom of the graph, you can see that for accommodation and food services, they are only at 81% the level of job of February. So obviously the restriction on the restaurants and also the fact that our border is closed is really having an impact on this sector. But in terms of the initial recovery, Canada is doing actually quite well. We are at 97% the level of job of February compared to 93% for the United States. So the initial recovery has been stronger than expected in Canada, stronger than other developed economies, just like, for example, the United States. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that the transfer from the federal government has been strong. The number of programs has increased, and actually the money spent by the federal government increased by 60% or by more than $200 billion. As a result, the disposable income in Canada has increased by 11%. The disposable income is basically the total revenue that Canadians are getting minus the taxes they pay. So that's basically the money that you have in your pocket. So on the one hand, some Canadians lost revenue because they lost their job or because they're not working as much. On the other hand, they received transfer from the federal government. The bottom line is our disposable income has increased by 11%. Also, as you know, interest rate has been declining very seriously, and the Bank of Canada has already announced they're not going to increase interest rates anytime soon. So the result of the lowest interest rate and also the program introduced by the federal government has really an impact on the economy. The housing start, for example, has been stronger than expected. The graph that you see is all housing starts in Canada, and you can see that during the summer, the number were quite strong. The housing market in general has been stronger than expected. Same thing for the retail sales. Retail sales are back now to the pre-crisis level, and they were back already in July. If we look at some subsectors, you can see that, for example, electronics and appliances stores, they are at 112% the level of February. That means that they are 12% higher than before the crisis. Some sectors are not coming back as quickly. Clothing, I guess, as many Canadians are working from home, they're not buying as many clothes. And also gasoline stations, which is not surprising because we're not commuting as much and we're not traveling as much. But in general, retail sales are back to the pre-crisis level. So the initial recovery in Canada has been stronger than expected, stronger than also other countries. Some sectors of our economy is already back to the pre-crisis level. However, the pace of the recovery is quite different from one sector to another. So the question is, what should we expect for the next 12 months? Well, we believe that the recovery, the last part of the recovery, is going to be at a slower pace than what we have seen over the summer for 4 reasons, and I'm going to detail them. First, the pandemic is not over. Second, consumers remain cautious. Third, business investment are going to be lower, and some key sectors of our economy will take more time to recover. So first, as you know, the pandemic is far from over. This is the number of new cases in Canada. After a pretty good summer, when kids went back to school and many Canadians went back to work at their workplace, you can see that the number of cases in Canada has increased significantly. The number of cases is actually high in many parts of the country. Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, Alberta, British Columbia, they had more cases today than in the spring. So this is very important because this has a potential to delay the recovery. For example, it had a huge impact on restaurants. At the beginning of September, the number of people going to restaurants, they were almost back to the pre-crisis level. But since we have more cases and some governments were forced to lock down some restaurants around the country, you can see that actually the occupation rate is quite low compared to what it was just a few months ago. The second reason is the fact that Canadians are very cautious with their money. This is the saving rate that we have since the beginning of the pandemic. You can see that Canadians are saving money. There's a lot of uncertainty around the economy. So that's the first thing that Canadians are doing. They're saving more money, which is good for them, but not good for the economy. So the second reason why we believe the rest of the recovery is going to take a little bit more time is because consumers will remain cautious because of the level of uncertainty. The third reason is on the business side. Business investment intention are down. We keep track of them every quarter. At the beginning of January, we had a positive number in this balance of opinion. So we were convinced that we were going to have a strong year in 2020. But of course, everything changed in April. And now business investment intention are down. That means that business investment are going to be down for the next 12 months. So it's going to take some time before businesses have the capacity and also the confidence to reinvest in their business. Finally, some key sectors of our economy are not going to come back at the same level or at the same pace than others. This is our forecast by sector. At the top right corner, you can see the sectors that are performing or they are rebounding the fastest. Pharma, ICT, retail, food manufacturing, these sectors are already back to the pre-crisis level. Of course, the opposite is in the yellow zone, where some sectors are going to take more time. Accommodation, restaurants, air transportation, everything related to tourism are going to lag. Also, manufacturing and aerospace or oil and gas, those two sectors are going to take more time to recuperate. So that's the fourth reason why we believe the recovery, the last part of the recovery, is going to be slower. Some key sectors of the Canadian economy are going to take more time. So this is our forecast. Today we are at the end of this initial recovery period, which has been strong, stronger than expected. However, we are not done yet. It's going to take some time before we go back to the pre-crisis level. There's a lot of uncertainty, so we have two scenarios. One is an optimistic scenario. Let's say we can control this second wave of the virus, and we have a vaccine in 2021. Well, in those cases, we believe that the Canadian economy is going to go back to the pre-crisis level at the beginning of 2022. If we cannot control the second wave, and for some reason the vaccine is delayed, well, this is going to delay the recovery, and that's our pessimistic scenario. In that case, we believe that we might have to wait until the end of 2023 before we go back to the pre-crisis level. Today, with the information we have, we are still optimistic. We still believe that we're going to have a vaccine and we can control the second wave. So we believe that we are going to go back to the pre-crisis level at the beginning of 2022. So finally, the last part of the presentation is about new consumer trends. The pandemic has changed how consumer behavior are. And there's three conclusions. The first one is the online business. The online business has doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. So more and more Canadians are buying online. The online business is not a new trend, but the pandemic has accelerated this trend. Today, there's 32% of Canadians who are saying they want to buy more online in the next 12 to 18 months. So this is important for business to understand that because they're going to miss out opportunities. The second trend is Canadians plan to buy more locally. They're looking for local products or at least for buying from local companies. The reason is they want to have a positive impact on their community in this difficult period of time. So you probably have noticed many companies have marketed themselves as a local or Canadian businesses. That's exactly what Canadians are looking for. Finally, the last trend is Canadians are health conscious more than ever before. 39% of Canadians say that high sanitary standards have become a selection criteria when they make a decision. I know a lot of businesses have spent money and energy to make sure that their clients and also their employees are safe. That's exactly what Canadians are looking for right now. So our business environment have changed. Business have changed because consumer behavior have changed. More people want to buy online than ever before. This is really accelerating. The consumers are looking for local product and they are more health conscious than before. So in conclusion, the Canadian economy recovery is well on the way, but we're not done yet. Even if the initial recovery was faster than expected and actually better than other developed economies, we still have a long way to go. And the rest of the recovery is going to depend how we can control the second part of the virus, the second wave of the virus, and also when we're going to get the vaccine. this will have a very important impact on the rest of the recovery.
For taking us through the overview and some important insights into the situation that we find ourselves in. So obviously some interesting, somewhat encouraging signals in terms of recognizing that there is going to be some level of recovery in different sectors, but clearly at different times. And of course, as you heard, we're going to need time to recover to those pre-pandemic, pre-crisis levels. This is a great launch, and thank you for doing that, for taking us into our moderated discussion with our distinguished panel. And with the panel conversation, we're going to focus on some critical areas. We're going to talk about the current state. What is the state of play right now? We want to talk about our government intervention and how resilient and helpful that has been. We also want to talk about really sort of unpacking and defining the economic impact, both locally for Niagara, provincially, and of course for Canada. And then we also want to look to the future. You just heard that pre-crisis levels will probably take until the end of 23. So in the meantime, clearly there are still measures and activities that we need to pursue. So as we start our panel discussion, I'd just like to take a moment and introduce you to our distinguished guests, Canadian leaders. And it's my pleasure to start with introducing you to the Honourable Perrin Beattie, who is President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canada's largest business organisation, and a post that he has held since 2007. He served for 21 years as a Member of Parliament and as Minister in 7 different portfolios. He is a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and an Officer of the Order of Canada. Welcome, Mr. Beattie. Also joining us this morning is Regional Chair Jim Bradley, who was elected in 2018 after serving as Member of Provincial Parliament for St. Catharines for 41 years. He has been a minister in the cabinets of 3 premiers of Ontario for 6 different ministries and is the second longest serving MPP in the province's history. Before his long career at Queen's Park, he was a St. Catharines City Councillor for 7 years. Welcome to you, Chair Bradley. And I also would like to welcome Rocco Rossi, who is the President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, appointed in 2018 after serving as President and CEO of Prostate Cancer Canada and CEO of the Heart and Stroke Foundation. He has held senior positions at the Boston Consulting Group, Torstar, Labatt Interbrew and MGI Software, and is a graduate of McGill and Princeton. Welcome to you, Mr. Rossi.
Pleasure.
And our final panelist this morning, I'm pleased to welcome Maya Roy, who is the CEO of YWCA Canada. She is part of Young Global Leaders with the World Economic Forum and is a past member of the Gender Equality Advisory Council for Canada's G7 presidency. She has worked with NGOs to support human rights and violence prevention in Thailand, Brazil, India, and the UK. And Ms. Roy holds degrees from the Ryerson School of Social Work and the London School of Economics. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for taking the time and for joining us this morning to share your expertise. So I'd like to just jump right in and talk about the current state, if I may. Obviously, our economy has been transformed almost overnight and almost beyond recognition as the coronavirus has brought economic activities to a standstill, as we saw, even with examples such as Open Table in terms of how that has shifted, as Mr. Clareau pointed out. And we can argue that countries around the world have universally failed to plan appropriately for this crisis. And the optimism that perhaps we may have felt earlier in the year may now be beginning to fade, and we're faced with some pretty grim realities. Mr. Rossi, Rocco, I'd like to start with you, please. Could I ask you, everybody has suffered in this pandemic and economic downturn. How in Ontario are we comparing provincially, please?
Well, thank you, Rashmi, and thanks to Mishka and the team for inviting me to join this incredible panel. As you saw from Pierre's charts, Ontario has the great good fortune of having the largest and most diversified economy in Canada. And so when you saw, manufacturing, finance, and insurance right at the top of recovery, we have the great benefit of having the largest concentrations of those sectors. So we're doing better than most. But as my dad always reminds me, be careful of crossing a river with an average depth of 1 meter. You come to holes, and there are massive holes with tremendous pain in tourism in the greater Niagara region, of course, restaurants and other areas. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're so tremendously blessed by having 140 chambers and boards of trade across the province, including led by Mishka right here in GNC, that have made a huge difference working with our colleagues at the CCC to get the policies that are needed. But we're not out of the woods yet. And the flip side of that diversified economy is we also have some of the densest population in the country, and that clearly is an issue that puts us not at the worst, but by no means at the best on a per capita basis of infection rates. And at the end of the day, great public health policy and outcomes is the key to sustained economic growth and recovery.
Thank you for that. And I think it's important to recognise the diversification across Ontario. And while that can be encouraging in some areas, of course, it may not be appropriate depending on the region that you find yourself in. So Chair Bradley, perhaps I could go to you, please. Could you offer a regional comparison? How do you feel that Niagara is faring economically compared to other regions?
We have major challenges, I have to say. And Rocco mentioned one in particular, and that is we're very reliant on the tourism industry. So when tourism is booming, we're quite delighted here in Niagara. It's producing a lot of jobs, producing a lot of economic activity, profits for those in the business. But tourism has been impacted immensely, much of it because the American border is closed at this time, and many of the people who would visit Niagara and spend their money here are in fact residents of the United States. But it's impacting the whole industry. So anything that's associated, you talk about restaurants, hotels, attractions, all are very much down in terms of what we can in the Niagara region. Other business has been affected as well, but not as drastically as tourism. And because tourism is so dominant here, that has made a major difference. It has meant that those of us at the local level have had to spend more money to compensate for this. We're delighted that the federal and provincial government have provided assistance at those levels to businesses, for instance, and to others. But our operations have been impacted very much by that. We operate, for instance, as a municipality, 8 nursing homes. And as you can appreciate, nursing homes require more staffing and more resources at this time. So we have been impacted that way, probably a little more than some other areas, again, because of tourism. When it bounces back, when tourism returns, I would say then we may be doing, in fact, better than some areas of the province. So we're impacted. Our numbers here in terms of cases have been relatively low compared to adjacent municipalities, except in the United States. And when we look at the fact that the border has been closed, it's with great justification. Their ability or desire, whatever it happens to be, to deal with the coronavirus on the other side of the border has been markedly different, and their numbers are much higher than our numbers are here. And as a general consensus of the mayors in this area, we have 12 area or local municipalities, as well as the region. The consensus has been keep the border closed until it's safe to do so. So that's where we would find ourselves. The Chamber of Commerce here, the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce, is very helpful in terms of assisting local businesses and keeping an eye on things and making recommendations to all levels of government, including municipal level of government, on how we can be of assistance.
Thank you for that, Chair Bradley. And as you say, it isn't necessarily simply about the kind of industry that it is in a particular region, but also the profile of the population and the demographics within that community as to how we're handling the pandemic. And of course, it is a real myth, isn't it, to suggest that the pandemic has been a leveler, an equalizer. It's been nothing but, really, or anything but. We're quite familiar now with the term around sort of pandemic privilege, and that some of us are in different situations than others. And I do want to explore that a little further and bring Ms. Roy in a moment. But before I do, I would just like to ask Mr. Beattie, if I may, taking the Canadian perspective, what have you seen, Mr. Beattie, as the greatest impact to industry or perhaps a sector or even a demographic group, just following up on that?
Well, my colleagues have already underscored the key one, and that's obviously anything associated with travel, tourism, hospitality, restaurants, hotels, and so on. Usually in a recession, it's first in and first out. In this instance, it's exactly the opposite. Tourism, travel were the first to be hit, and yet they're going to be the last to come back out of the recession. So they are badly affected. And if you look at it demographically as well, it has been uneven in terms of its effects. Women are more hard hit than men, and a recovery for the full economy is going to require that women are able to return to work. So issues like childcare come to the fore as a consequence. Younger people are harder hit. If people are doing layoffs, it tends to be last hired, first fired. Same with new Canadians. And so the impacts of the pandemic have been uneven across the country. The other point I would make, Pierre's presentation was just excellent, and he pointed out various sectors, the ones that were doing well, the ones that weren't. People refer to a so-called K-shaped recovery, where some sectors are moving ahead very well, some are lagging. But even in the case of a sector like retail, which Pierre highlighted is actually up from where it was, it's important to disaggregate the figures. There's no doubt that people like Amazon are doing very, very well. I'm not sure every retailer with a storefront in Niagara region is going to feel that they've had the same success and have seen things bouncing back the same way. So we need to look even within sectors at what the impact is as opposed to across the board. There was another, Pierre, there was another interesting anomaly there that when you were mentioning that Canadians were prepared to buy local, had to put a premium on buying local. That's good news. But you also pointed out that online sales were booming. Guess where the online sales are going for the most part? And you tend usually not to use your computer to make the purchase from the local clothing store, but to make a purchase from further away. So what will be important is for us to drill down on the figures and get a better sense as to where we are. But the bottom line here is that the impact has been very uneven across the economy. And it means then that from the perspective of public policy, instead of across the board, one size fits all measures, which are often one size fits none, we need to be much more tailored and design programs to deal with circumstances as they exist on the ground.
Thank you for that, Mr. Beattie. And as you say, this nuanced approach is likely what's called for in terms of intervention. So let's turn our attention to the state interventions if we can. And I think it's fair to say that governments have actually demonstrated that the public sector can in fact move very quickly. And there has been a flurry of not only the lockdowns and the public health measures, but there have been subsidies, grants and financial assistance to industry and business. And Mr. Beattie, if I just may stay with you for a moment, please. How would you say the relief efforts and the government programs have been helping? And do you see any specific gaps that have been left open?
Could I just nuance your premise about the speed at which governments operate? For those of us who've been in government, we can tell you that this is breakneck speed for government. But by private sector terms, it isn't. And often governments have been a day late and a dollar short. They were late in closing the border. They were late in bringing in programs. For those people looking most recently, retailers looking for rent subsidies, late in terms of having the program in place to help. But by government standards, the speed is stunning. And there are lessons for us to learn from all of that. as we prepare for future pandemics. Some of the programs have been excellent. The wage subsidy program is an example of that. It's helped to keep people attached to their employers. And I suspect that some of the figures that Pierre was showing in terms of Canada's relative success relative to the US in terms of employment is as a result of the fact that government subsidy programs have kept people attached to the workforce. Without that, the unemployment figures would have been much, much higher. Some of the loan programs that they have for businesses, again, very positive. The rental subsidy program, as was initially designed, was not a success. A mistake I think government made at the front end is they focused, first of all, in putting money into assisting people who were laid off, and that's critical. But the very highest priority should be to prevent layoffs, to ensure that people could stay connected to employers. So the wage subsidy program should have come at a higher level more rapidly with a higher emphasis on that. Our goal needs to be to keep people attached to employers and ensure that they have something to go back to after this is over. So the story is mixed, but there has been better outreach by government at all levels than ever before that I can remember. And the government has moved in government terms more rapidly than I can remember in previous crises.
Thank you for that. And as you say, it is important to recognise the extraordinary speed in which some of these decisions had to be made and then executed and implemented. And we saw
that's why I might add why we shouldn't be we're critical of government from time to time that a program has missed the mark, that it was there was a design failure. We are literally designing and building the aircraft as we're flying in it, and programs that would have taken months design in ordinary times are being put together in days. So it's not at all surprising that they have to be fine-tuned and improved as we go along.
Yes, absolutely. Was it Chair Bradley who was trying to make a comment at that point?
In terms of what we can do, for instance, to assist business and the general operations, we're quite limited. As you know, our only source of income, or our primary source of income, is the property tax. And we are not able to really find other source of revenue outside of appealing to the federal and provincial government. We've done that. We have been able to waive some late payment fees, for instance. That's been very, very helpful. But we're really not able to say to people, you don't have to pay your taxes at all, because our operations have to continue. I want to pay a compliment to both the federal and provincial government and call of municipalities for assistance. It has meant that the somewhat drastic increases in expenditures that would be reflected in an increase in property taxes will not have to happen as a result of the intervention of the federal and provincial government. We were among the last to be considered, but when the funds started to flow, we recognized that, for instance, in our area, probably $80 million, if you put together both the local municipalities and the regional municipality, was what it was going to cost us. And we undertook some mitigation measures, as we were able to do. But if you look at the regional level of government here, virtually all of our services are mandatory and ongoing.
So let me ask you, Chair Bradley, have you had to cut services and/or staff and programs?
We actually redeployed people. We did not actually make those cuts. Local municipalities were able to do so. If you're operating an arena or a park, thing of that nature, and they're closed down, obviously their employment levels are lowered. But when you're delivering ambulance services, police services, public health, where the increase is significant, long-term care, and those kind of services, operating the sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants, you're unable to cut those. But we were able to redeploy people to go into the nursing homes and other areas. In addition, about 200 of our employees left for a variety of reasons, either for other opportunities or they couldn't get childcare, for instance, so they have their own volition left. But we did take some mitigating measures. And we're just not in the position. KPMG did an assessment of the services we provided and said only 8% of the services provided by the region were in fact discretionary. 92% were mandatory.
So at this point, you're not anticipating any cuts to social programs?
We're not at this point in time. We're mandated by the provincial government to administer those programs. And of course, the demands have been greater because people are having a very challenging time now as individuals, same as businesses.
Yes.
So we're not anticipating those. And we're hopeful that as we go into 2021, the senior levels of government will continue to provide some assistance to get us through this very difficult time. We hope eventually, of course, to be back to normal. But that will be a while yet with all the predictions we have to have.
Yes. I'm very happy to hear that, Mr. Bradley, because I think one thing with this pandemic is the pandemic is very much showing what was already broken in society. So one of the things we've seen at the YWCA is that increase for services have gone up anywhere between 20 to 40%. Rates of domestic violence have increased. Hate crimes have increased in some parts of Canada over 600%. What I'm seeing, for example, and thank you very much to Mishka for inviting me on this panel, my colleagues at the Niagara YWCA have been very focused on providing made in Niagara, made in Canada solutions. So for example, we know that in times of economic crisis, rates of homelessness, structural poverty, and sexual exploitation and human trafficking increase. So for example, my colleagues have actually developed a 24-hour safe house, and we're seeing young people as young as 15. 5 to 6 young women a month who are essentially leaving situations of human trafficking. So, for example, I think the work that the region is doing with Mr. Bradley, my colleagues at the Niagara YWCA, are actually working with first responders to train them to recognize the signs of human trafficking. So there's absolutely the economic impacts, but then there's the social impacts as well. And when you look at, for example, for those of you who are working with investors in Singapore, Singapore as a city-state, very early on in the pandemic, they were able to control the first wave and the second wave. But what they forgot about was actually the most vulnerable in their community, migrant labor from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And then they actually found that their second wave pandemic control methods, basically COVID cases started to peak because they hadn't considered who was the most vulnerable and how that actually impacted COVID rates. So I think the discussion we're having here today and really talking about some of the most vulnerable community members and how it's impacting them is very important, because we're all in this boat together. And as we see with COVID, it's not just contagious. It can actually, the structural poverty and violence below the surface can actually increase COVID rates. So for this reason, the United Nations is actually referring to the shadow pandemic. So the shadow pandemic of gender violence and structural poverty that's also driving COVID rates.
Thank you, Ms. Roy, and I appreciate you contributing to that from a social and economic perspective, because we can't really separate the two at this point. I mean, this is all part of the fabric of our community. And Chair Bradley even made the comment that some employees hadn't returned to work for a childcare issue. So we're seeing the striking inequities in terms of how the pandemic has impacted people economically and, of course, socially. And, of course, the YW Canada brought out a remarkably detailed and well-researched document, the Feminist Recovery Plan, in partnership with GATE at Rotman at the University of Toronto. And I know that Niagara is paying attention to that. And I know also that Ontario Chamber brought out the She Recovery. So there has been some really thoughtful, mindful, deliberate work in this area. If I may ask you, Ms. Roy, as a follow-up, do you feel that the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan has been adopted in different municipalities or different cities across the country?
I think the pandemic is giving us an opportunity to build back better. It was very much like all reports, it was food for thought and to start a dialogue and a discussion. So that's why I'm very glad that I'm able to be here today. So when the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is talking about not just doing a one-size-fits-all approach to actually acknowledge that the pandemic is hitting women harder, it's hitting newcomers harder, I think that's really important. And we saw that. We saw, for example, even with the initial recovery that Pierre was showing in his slides, 70% of the jobs lost in March 2020, it was actually women. But then we saw in May that men's jobs were actually coming back at a faster rate than women's. So men's jobs were returning in May 2020 at 2.4%. And for women, it was much slower recovery. It was actually at 1.1%. And that's really for two reasons. The first reason is lack of access to childcare, as has already been noted. Both RBC and Scotiabank have released reports indicating that because of the lack of a universal, affordable federal system of childcare, women's workforce participation rates have dropped to rates not seen since the early 1980s. So in terms of a talent pipeline issue for businesses, that's certainly impacting women. We're also seeing that women newcomers tend to work in occupations that are hit harder by the pandemic. So what we refer to as the 3 Cs, care work, cleaning, and customer service. Those are not contactless professions. And whereas, for example, in the 2008-2009 recession, jobs were able to come back faster, with the pandemic, we also know, for example, whether it's a hair salon or as you know, the slides were showing around retail versus bricks and mortar businesses, all of those jobs have been lost and are unlikely to return. We also see rates of automation accelerating. So for example, for Indigenous communities, job loss rate is actually much higher than for non-Indigenous community members at 33%. So one of the things that we're really encouraging people to think about is let's have an evidence-based recovery. Let's use the data to drive recovery. And there's some really, really interesting information. For example, in Quebec, when Quebec invested as a province in childcare, for every $100 that they invested in childcare, not only did social assistance rates go down and workforce participation rates go up, for every $100 that Quebec invested in childcare, they actually received $104 back in taxes. And the federal government received an additional $34 in tax revenue base increase.
So that's really interesting. And I think, you know, it's important to look at the data, as you say, and look at the numbers. Yes. And actually, I want to bring Rocco into this conversation, please, because as we talk about recognizing that we've had something of a rebound, but now we seem to be slowing down and there's a slower pace of recovery, is there an appetite for further spending, Rocco, do you think, from a government perspective? Is there capacity for government budgets at different levels? What do you think is going to some of the outcomes, perhaps, of future spending if we're not able to pursue?
Well, and those two aspects of that question are the important ones. There's certainly a will. There's a demonstrated will. We are leading much of the world in terms of the amount of spending as a percentage of GDP that we've been doing. The question becomes around capacity, and my colleague Perrin Beatty has been a leader on the notion of the need for some kind of fiscal anchor as we think about it, because ultimately we're going to have to move from an economy of subsidy, and to be clear, with the charts that Pierre was showing, a big part of the reason that the numbers were showing quite well was government spending. And we're going to have to move to one of private sector economic growth. So our bias is, as you look at additional expenditures beyond simply keeping people's head above water in this crisis and dealing with the public health issues, what are the things, exactly to Maya's point, what are the things that are going to allow us to build in economic growth for the future? So if you're going to have a filter for those investments, and I'll give you a perfect one, because one of the cleavages across all of the disparity is the digital divide, right? If you've been able to if you've been able to work from home, if you've been able to sell your goods and services online, you are doing better than everyone else. And the fact that the provincial government, the federal government are both making significant investments in expansion of broadband into rural and remote regions. I mean, it's not just the economy. You want to deliver virtual healthcare? You can't do that on dial-up. You want to keep kids at home for online learning or for skilling and reskilling, and they only have dial-up? It's not going to happen. You're going to have that disparity. So if you want to build in growth for the future, let's look at those key infrastructure investments. Let's look at those societal policies, whether it's daycare. And part of the issue on the recovery for women was not just affordability, was simply availability, because quite frankly, in a health crisis, those daycare centers had to shut down. So that's a big part of the reason women were not coming back at the same rate that men were, and that needs to be corrected. But that's going to also go hand in hand with the crisis. There's appetite. There is a question of capacity, because at some point the printing presses blow up. So we need to have that bias towards policies that build in economic growth, because that ultimately is what's going to pay down the bills and create the long-term sustainable jobs that are going to help pay for the programs that all of us want to not only build back better, but I would say build forward better, because we want a new reality. We don't want to simply get back to where we were.
And I think these are, I'm going to ask Mr. Clareau, if I may, how is this public debt going to affect us in the future? So clearly, significant investments. We heard yesterday about the significant investment in broadband, as you say. So, Mr. Clareau, please, if you would, how is the public debt going to affect us as we move forward as a country?
I think somebody mentioned that we spent a lot of money during the last 6 months, more than any other economy in terms of money we spend per capita. But the good news is we had a good starting point. Our debt to GDP ratio was the lowest among the G7 countries in February. Still today, after all the money we spend, we're still, one of the best country in terms of having a low debt ratio. So we are still in good shape. But the deficit at the federal level is going to be somewhere around 350 billion just this year. Ontario has announced its deficit at 35 billion. So these amounts are really, really large. So we were in a good position, but I totally agree we need a balanced approach for the future. If we want to keep our ability to react in the future crisis, if we were able to spend a lot of money over the last 6 months and help Canadians and Canadian businesses, is because we were in a very good position before. So we have to remember that for the next crisis. So we need a balanced approach between helping Canadians, helping the economy to recover, but at the same time, having a plan to rebalance our budget in the long run to make sure that we are prepared for possible another crisis in the future. So I don't think any government will do it rapidly, would be having a negative impact on the economy. Nobody wants to do that. But we have to think about a long-term plan about reducing our debt in the next decade.
Thank you. Mr. Beattie, did you want to comment?
Pierre put his finger on the key criterion here. We need a plan. We don't have a plan today. And we are faced now with a $1.2 trillion debt as a result of this. And this is the floor. It's not the ceiling. We'll find with each successive budget that debt is going to be growing. At this point, we have no strategy for putting our fiscal house back in order. So as we look at new programs, Rocco absolutely correctly stressed the point that in terms of the emergency spending that is being done to help people and help businesses make it to the other shore and survive, it's critical that be there, and we strongly support that. If we're talking about new structural spending, recurring spending year after year, We have to look at that. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, if a program was unaffordable in February because the government didn't have the money then pre-pandemic, how does it become affordable now, $1.2 trillion later? So we need a strategy that sets out how we get our fiscal house back in order. The key element of that is that we have to move away from a subsidies-based economy to one in which there is growth again, in which the activity is taking place in the private sector. We can't borrow our way back to prosperity. We're going to have growth and investment to be able to do that. So in the short term, yes, let's take whatever measures are necessary to be able to help people survive, but we need to have that recovery strategy that we don't have as yet that will allow us to reopen the economy safely, with the emphasis on safely, as rapidly as possible, and to move to a more normalized. And Maya made the point very well as well about the social impacts of the pandemic and of the lockdowns that we're enduring. We're all tracking very closely what's happening in terms of spread of the virus, as we should, and in terms of death rates, hospitalizations, and so on. What we're not tracking as closely is, what about the rates of family violence, of suicide, of the problems of cancers coming into hospitals late because people haven't been able to go in earlier. And so we need two strategies. One is a strategy for recovery and to get our house in order. And the other is a national COVID management strategy. And it's interesting to see that in the United States, the very first thing that Joe Biden has promised is a national COVID strategy. We need one here to manage the disease as opposed to simply responding to it.
And I think your point about investments is really important, because it's also not a zero-sum game in terms of trade-offs. We know that investing, for example, in the care economy can actually create jobs. Canada and the US are the only OECD countries that do not invest 1% of their GDP in childcare. We also see very good economic forecasting coming out of the UK, indicating that if they invest 1% of their economy, of their GDP and care work, it actually creates 2 million jobs and increases employment rate by 5%. So I think there are some really interesting ways that we can actually invest in the social side of things, but that will also drive prosperity. And investing in childcare is simply one of them. Social procurement is another, especially for diverse minority entrepreneur business owners.
And Maya, we should have, as an example, in the short term, we got through the first wave. We should have been pouring money into protecting the most vulnerable in our society to prepare for the second wave. It is going to cost us in human lives, and it's going to cost us in dollars that we didn't do that.
So on that note, can I ask, when we talk about the recovery that we've seen, or the slight recovery that we saw some strength in the summer. Ms. Roy, if I may ask you, did the vulnerable populations benefit at all from any of that rebound that we saw?
Unfortunately not. Perrin made a very good point around other health impacts. So for example, for community members, we actually saw at YWCA shelters, we saw opioid overdose rates triple in some instances. So that really tragic intersection of poverty and trauma and mental health. The social isolation of quarantine is not making that better. We're also seeing women's jobs come back much more slowly. We're also seeing in this really exciting global reckoning around anti-racism and Black Lives Matters, where, you know, one of the positive pieces that we are seeing is that investors are asking firms and charities to do better. So it's very interesting for us as an organization trying to connect Indigenous women to the labor market. It's always been very challenging with racial discrimination. When you look at the CFL franchise and the fact that they had a racial epithet in their name in 2020, that should be unacceptable for any brand to have a pejorative racial slur in the actual brand. But it was actually investors that asked the CFL franchise to do better. And once Boston Pizza pulled out as an investor, there was this whole domino effect. So I think, you know, going back to Pierre's slides, The demographic changes that we're seeing in Canada are also driving investor behavior and consumer behavior. Indigenous youth and newcomers are two of the fastest growing demographics in the country. And I think we're going to see more human rights activism coming from these two communities that are also going to shape investor and consumer behavior as we try and do better with respects to anti-racism.
Yes, as the social and economic concerns arise, then of course we need to address both simultaneously, as has been discussed. I want to go back to Mr. Beatty's point about growth and recognizing that we need this COVID national strategy and to really have a positive growth direction for reopening. Mr. Beatty, if I could ask you, the closure of the US border, the US-Canadian border to non-essential traffic has really affected businesses and the economy. Do you have any sense of when or under what circumstances this might reopen?
No time soon is the answer on that. Until such time as the Americans can get the pandemic under control on their side of the border, there will be zero appetite on the part of Canadians to open it here. Jim mentioned that point in terms of the Niagara mayors. This is striking. These are people who are seeing their businesses badly hit by the loss of tourism, but they're saying we're prioritizing public health ahead of the economy in this case. That would be the priority that all Canadians would have. The Americans have badly mishandled the pandemic. They need to get under control. Until such time as they do it, it'll be very hard to reopen the 49th parallel. I would expect that we are probably going to be seeing intercontinental travel to Canada starting to open up perhaps even before Canada-US travel. For example, if you had a plane load of people coming in from Singapore today, or from Korea, or from Japan, or from Australia, the incidence of COVID on that plane would be lower than the incidence in the airport in which they landed. So the idea of using rapid testing and an air bridge makes sense if you've got a community on the other side that is properly managing the disease. Unfortunately, in the US at this point, they're not doing it. And that means for our tourism sector, they're going to continue to be very badly hit as a consequence.
Thank you. And I'd like to just pan out for a moment and go back to the sort of macro perspective and bring in Mr. Clareau again. And just, Pierre, perhaps you could reflect on, have we been too focused? Have we been too focused on efficiency and growth and not enough on resiliency and in terms of the recovery? And do you feel that we are addressing economically at a national COVID strategy perspective? Do you feel like we're taking that angle, or are we too insulated and too isolated in our approaches?
I'm not sure. I think the obviously for the last 6 months, the focus was on to really deal with this emergency we had. So I think in large, government did very well, compared to other countries around the world, and I would say that Canadian did very well, because if we are controlling the number of cases we have in Canada, is because everybody is making an effort compared to if you look at the United States or France or UK, where the number of cases are out of control. So I think that was a priority, but I agree that we need now a strategy, because like I show in my graph, the pandemic is not over yet. We're still stuck with that for a while. I know there was an announcement for a vaccine, but before everybody in Canada has a vaccine, it's going to take at least 6, 9, 12 months probably, just because the logistic of distribution is going to be quite difficult. So we have to plan now for how can we rebuild, or can we accelerate this recovery, that knowing that we have some restriction. Mr. Biddy was really right. It's going to take a long time before tourism is coming back to the way it was before the pandemic, because of the restrictions, also because the situation in the US. So we need to have a better strategy about what we do now for the next 12 to 24 months to make sure that we are able to grow again and to compensate for those sectors who are going to take a bit more time. One thing, I want to make sure people, there's some positive of all this. For example, where research is showing that businesses in Canada have been really focusing on investing in technology to improve their efficiency. And that's going to be positive for businesses and for the economy for years to come. So this is a great timing to do it. A lot of businesses are investing in technology right now. That's the only place they invest, basically, in our research. But that's a good news. They invest in technology to be more present online, to encourage teleworking, to also get more efficient, to be able to reduce their costs. So this is going to put businesses in a better position for the next decade. So there's some positives coming out of this crisis.
And I appreciate that. And we definitely do want to talk about some of the optimism and perhaps even the confidence levels that some businesses are feeling. I'm going to just, before we move on to that particular focus, you had said in your presentation, Mr. Clareau, that the economic recovery, sort of pre-crisis recovery, would be something like 2023. Do you see that as equitable, province-wide, nationwide? How do you feel that might play out across the country?
Well, actually, it's going to depend on the sector. Some sectors are already doing quite well. If you look, for example, manufacturing sector is back to the pre-crisis level. The ICT, everything related to technology, they are back to the pre-crisis level. But some sectors are going to take more time. We have been talking, everything related to tourism is going to take more time. Some part of manufacturing, for example, aerospace, Air Canada announced yesterday they are going to cancel 40% of their order for planes. So obviously, the sector that is building planes and parts is going to suffer from that. Oil and gas, which is not very important for the east part of the country, but very important for the west part of the country, it's going to take probably another 2 or 3 years before they go back to the pre-crisis level. So the region, the impact on the region will depend on the sector you have in terms of your structure of your economy. Ontario has a very diversified economy, like we mentioned before. Some key sectors are performing well. Finance, manufacturing, ICT is Toronto is the ICT hub in Canada. So these sectors are going to move the economy forward. It's going to be more difficult in some part of the country, for example, in Alberta, where oil is a very big part of the economy. So it's going to really be related of the sector you have in your region.
So let's bring that closer to home then. Chair Bradley, if I could ask you to comment, please. What do you see as the long-term economic impact of the pandemic in Niagara, given that our industry is very heavily service, tourism-based?
Clearly what we have to do is to get the virus under control. There's a great temptation now because of what we refer to as coronavirus fatigue, that somehow we should start opening up rather widely. The Ontario government has wisely listened to the counsel and advice of the scientific and medical community to ensure that decisions are based on those factors as opposed to simply the fatigue. Yes, we understand the implications of that, and there are some drawbacks to that. But clearly, we have to get the virus under control before we can get everything flowing back the way we want it to, including the tourism business. And that's hard to say for some because that's where particularly senior levels of government have to intervene to ensure those who are most impacted by the tougher regulations and the clampdown, that they are compensated because it's not their fault, but they are certainly impacted by it. But I think we have to resist the temptation to start opening things wide up, and also resist those, we see the demonstrations taking place all over the world of people who are opposed to masks or other measures being taken. We have to resist that as well. And I think governments, by and large, have done that. So, in municipalities, for instance, we tend to want to be in a more flexible situation in terms of our category. But until we get this coronavirus under control, we're going to continue to have problems. And the second wave has proven to be even worse than the first wave, and that was predicted by some. So let's get that under control and provide the necessary compensation to business and others until we do.
Thank you. And Ms. Roy, just to sort of building on some of those comments from Chair Bradley, what do you see looking ahead to the future is going to be the true on-the-ground impact of this recession on businesses, families, the poor, the disadvantaged, and those who stand to lose or may in fact have already lost?
What we're concerned about at the YWCA is essentially this whole notion of a lockdown generation. You have young people who were unable to pay off student debts and really get a foothold into the labor market as a result of the 08-09 recession, who are also sort of being doubly hit right now. You have women who are withdrawing from the labor market who may not go back, which will also impact recruitment and retention for companies that need to expand in terms of their workforce. I think fundamentally, the next 2 to 3 years are going to be very challenging as we see increased political volatility in the States impacting Canadian social policy. In terms of the second wave, we know from previous epidemiological records that the second and the third waves tend to be worse. And unfortunately, as we also know, as my colleagues in the HIV and AIDS sector keep reminding me, there's no guarantee of a vaccine. So for us at YWCA, we were watching the Pfizer announcement yesterday very closely in terms of the vaccine efficacy. And once that data is submitted for peer review, essentially looking at working with supply chain experts to actually get that vaccine into the most vulnerable community members' hands to ensure that just because you're poor doesn't mean that your health should be impacted with respects to COVID.
So the vaccine may well amplify further inequities as we move forward in terms of recovery, in terms of access to the vaccine. I do want to spend some time taking some questions from our audience and hear from our business leaders and from our members, of course, and our audience. But just to close off this panel, if I may just ask about confidence level then from businesses. What are you hearing, Mr. Beattie and Mr. Rossi? What are you hearing from businesses in Canada and then again in Ontario about how confident they're feeling about the future? Mr. Beattie, if I may start with you, please. Confidence in Canadian businesses right now.
You're muted still, Perrin.
Thank you.
Yep. This is, everybody heaved a sigh of relief, probably, Rocco. In the short term, confidence is low. The polls show it, and anecdotally, when you talk to people, they're worried about what this second wave will mean, how long it will last. And I think COVID fatigue is something that we have to highlight as well. We all had the sense as we moved into sunnier days in the summer that we were emerging from the tunnel. Now we find ourselves going back in with a very long, bleak, cold, lonely winter, and that affects everybody's attitude. Where there's uncertainty, business pulls back. If you were looking to invest several millions of dollars, you'd want to know, well, what are the conditions I'm going into? What are the policy? What's the policy framework? What is the broader environment that I'm going into? At this point, there's sufficient uncertainty that it causes people to pull back. That will change as this progresses, obviously, but in the short term, it's a difficult environment that doesn't encourage the investment that we need to stimulate a genuine recovery.
Absolutely. And Rocco, if I may ask you the same question, please, from a provincial perspective, what are you hearing about confidence levels?
I think Perrin has stated it very well. The one thing I would add is really an addendum to the question you asked earlier, Rashmi, about resilience. And a very big concern I have there, because it used to be that we talked about, just-in-time manufacturing and supply chains, and now we're talking about just in case. And that's leading a lot of people to look inward. And on the one hand, it's good. We hear the Premier say we want to make sure that we're never going to have to depend on anyone else ever again for PPE. We're going to manufacture it here. And Pierre pointed out the desire on people's parts to buy local and celebrate local, and that's all important. But for a relatively small country economically, we're 2 to 3% of global GDP, the one concern a very big concern that I have is if you go into a world that starts to look inward and moves away from the global trends to freer trade, which we have benefited from, not without complications, don't get me wrong, but generally speaking, Canada and Ontario have benefited tremendously from that. That is a big concern that we have going forward to a world that may close down because of the reaction to the crisis.
Thank you, and thank you to all our panel members. I appreciate the depth and the interest in the conversation and bringing your expertise. And if I could press upon you for a few more moments, we do actually have some great questions from our audience, and I would like to take a couple of moments to bring those forward. So Ken Scholtens, thank you, Ken, for the question. Ken's question is, what impact could Pfizer's announcement of a vaccine that has an efficacy rate of 90%, what could the impact of this be on the economic recovery? Pierre, may I start with you, please, on that, what your thoughts are from an economic perspective?
Well, I think it's positive, and we saw, the stock market reacting very positively. But, it's just one announcement. And like we said a little bit before, the pandemic is not over. And first of all, it's not guaranteed that this vaccine is going to work. And also the logistic of distributing this vaccine is quite complex. But it's a good news, and there's going to be other good news. Other teams around the world are working on a vaccine. So personally, I'm not an expert, but I'm quite optimistic that we're going to have a vaccine in 2021, and we need that. We will not have a full recovery before we have a vaccine, because the restriction on some sectors are going to stay until we have a vaccine. So we need a vaccine before we have a full recovery.
Thank you. And I would like to bring in one more question from Al McKay. Thank you very much, Al, for your question. In the light of the crisis, has the regional chair revisited the idea of running the region differently? Chair Bradley, this is for you. For example, service delivery, number of politicians, tax increase.
We have had unprecedented cooperation between the municipalities within the Niagara region. The mayors, for instance, along with myself, keep in touch by a conference call, and our CAOs are all working together. So there's been, I think, an unprecedented effort to work together as municipalities to achieve the goals that we want to. And we have made, where it's been possible, we have been able to reduce some of our expenditures. We've also been pleased to, as I say, work with the federal and provincial government in other areas. In terms of the number of politicians and things of that nature, that really hasn't impacted what we are doing at the present time. Again, the regional council is working exceedingly hard on this, the committees of council. But I do want to say that we've had an effort on the part of the CAOs to find areas of common interest where we can find any efficiencies. We're doing that regardless of the COVID-19 crisis that we're confronted with, but certainly that has accelerated our efforts, and I'm very optimistic that we will see benefits from that particular effort.
And that's great to hear and encouraging that you're getting such good cooperation. Thank you for your comments. And I just wanted to take another question from Emily Kovacs from the Niagara Folk Arts. Thank you, Emily, for your question. And it is, the pandemic has clearly demonstrated racial, gender-based and structural inequalities as it relates to people of colour, immigrants, Indigenous peoples and Black communities. How can the Economic Summit leverage their leadership obligations to fight for social and economic justice for equity-seeking groups? Ms. Roy, might I first ask you to respond to that question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily, for the great question. I think it's about actually asking vulnerable community groups and including them in your user journeys. Work with them to test solutions. We have the solutions. We've been thinking about them and doing the research and collecting the data for decades. But absolutely, this recovery is not a full recovery unless people of color, people living with disabilities, and Indigenous community members also benefit from recovery efforts. I just very quickly around the Pfizer announcement, because I have a clinical health background and was on the front lines of SARS, something very important to remember is none of the Pfizer data has actually been submitted for peer review. So I think it's let's be cautious as we wait for peer review of the data. We still also don't know how long the vaccine actually lasts. So we might be very similar to a situation like the flu vaccine, where we have to get a COVID vaccine on an annual basis or every 6 months, depending on efficacy. So absolutely, it's challenging as business leaders as we navigate this new world with all of the moving parts.
Yes, and an important caveat. Thank you for that. I do want to just reflect one of the poll questions. We asked our audience if their organization had been harmed by the pandemic and economic downturn. Only 13% said no. So we have 87% reporting that somewhere between some impact and a good deal of impact. Yes, in fact, this of course has affected everybody significantly in economic terms. The other poll results will be shared with the audience via email, so we thank you for taking your time and for contributing to that. And I just want to thank you, our panel, for your intellect, your expertise, your depth and breadth of knowledge, and for sharing that with us this morning and guiding us through and helping us navigate this very difficult time. So Rocco Rossi, thank you. Pierre Claroux, Mr. Beattie, thank you. Maya Roy, and of course, Chair Bradley. It was wonderful to have you with us, and we truly appreciate you helping us start the Summit Series in such a positive and important way. And thank you to our audience. And before we finish, I would just like to hand back to Mishka Balsam, our CEO at GNCC here in Niagara.
This concludes the first of a three-part series. I want to thank our moderator and panelists for approaching today's discussion with substance and insight, a real treat of a dialogue that opens our minds to the forces that will shape our recoveries. Thank you, Rashmi Biswas with Lake & Associates, Pierre Claroux with BDC, Jim Bradley, Chair of the Niagara Region, Maya Roy with YWCA, and my chamber colleagues, Perrin Beattie with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and Rocco Rossi with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. This dialogue was made possible by our partners, Niagara Region Economic Development, Goodman School of Business, Brock University, Niagara College, DDL & Co., RBC, Deloitte, BDC, Niagara Workforce Planning Board, Pegasus Aviation, and Easy Rock News Talk 610 CKTB. To all participants, thank you for being part of today's session. Please join us next week for the second session, and the link can be found on our site, gncc.ca. Thank you.